The Lichen Air, Chapter 1. The Stranger in the Woods. The fog in Blackwood Valley was not a mere atmospheric condition. It was a physical presence, heavy and damp, smelling of old decay and wet pine needles. It rolled off the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountains, settling in the lowlands where the ancient trees grew thick and tangled. For 3 years, Clara had lived in a small, weathered log cabin situated at the edge of this wilderness, working as a research biologist for the state's forestry department. The focus was on apex predators, specifically the migrating patterns of wolves. But over the past 6 weeks, her data had begun to warp into something unrecognizable. It started with the audio recordings. The parabolic microphones she had placed in the deep ridges captured vocalizations that made her hair stand on end. They were wolf-like, but the frequency was deep enough to rattle the cabin's window panes, carrying a strange, layered resonance that sounded almost like 2 voices speaking in unison. Then came the physical evidence, a series of tracks near the northern creek bed. The paw prints were massive, easily 9 inches long, showing deep claw indentations that suggested an animal of immense weight. Most disturbing, however, were the photos from her trail cameras. Clara spent her mornings sitting at her wooden desk, sipping black coffee, and scrolling through grainy, black and white infrared images. Several times, the motion sensor cameras had caught a shape and muscular, its head long and distinctly canine, melting back into the thick brush. The digital timestamp read 3:14 a.m. Determined to find answers, Clara packed her rugged backpack on a late Tuesday afternoon, intent on checking the high-altitude cameras near Whispering Ridge. The weather forecast had warned of a mild rain, but by the time she reached the rocky incline, the sky had bruised into a deep, threatening purple. The temperature plunged. The wind began to howl through the canopy, whipping the heavy pine branches and sending showers of cold needles onto her hood. Within minutes, the sky opened. It was a torrential, freezing deluge that turned the dry dirt trail into a slick, muddy slide. "Damn it," Clara muttered, shivering as the rain penetrated her jacket's collar. She turned to make her descent, but her boot slipped on a wet, mossy root. She lost her footing completely. She tumbled down a steep, rocky ravine. The world became a blur of dark green, grey stone, and wet earth. Branches clawed at her face and tore at her clothes. She slid down the muddy slope, bracing for a bone-shattering collision with the jagged rocks at the bottom. Before she could hit, she was caught. Massive, warm hands wrapped around her waist, stopping her momentum instantly. Clara gasped, her eyes snapping open. She was pressed against a chest that felt as solid as a stone wall, radiating an intense, unnatural heat that cut through the freezing rain. The scent of him hit her immediately, a heady mix of pine wood, copper, crushed leaves, and a sharp electric charge, like ozone before a lightning strike. "You shouldn't be out here." A deep, raspy voice vibrated through the man's chest. Clara looked up, her breath hitching. The man holding her was towering, easily 6'5", with broad, powerful shoulders and a jawline that looked carved from basalt. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead by the rain, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a striking liquid amber, catching the dim forest light in a way that seemed almost reflective, like the tapetum lucidum of a nocturnal predator. I slipped," Clara managed to say, her voice shaking from the sudden rush of adrenaline. "My ankle. I think I twisted it." Julian didn't reply. He simply shifted his grip, sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as easily as if she were a child. The ease of his movement was unsettling. Clara was not a small woman, yet he carried her up the slick, muddy embankment without a single slip, his boots finding grip on the treacherous ground where she had fallen. "I'm Julian," he said quietly, as he began the trek back down the mountain toward her cabin. "Clara," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck for stability. The heat radiating from his skin was incredible, protecting her from the biting cold of the storm. She felt a strange magnetic pull toward him, an instinctual voice in her head telling her that she was safe, yet warning her that she was in the presence of a predator. By the time they reached her cabin, the storm had fully set in, the rain thumping against the wooden shingles. Julian carried her inside, setting her down gently on the plush sofa near the stone fireplace. He moved around the cabin with an unsettling, fluid grace, immediately kneeling before her to inspect her ankle. His large hands were calloused but incredibly gentle as he unlaced her muddy boot and pulled off her wet sock. "It's not broken," Julian murmured, his thumb lightly tracing the swelling skin of her ankle. A jolt of pure electricity shot through Clara at his touch. He looked up, his amber eyes locking onto hers. "But you need to rest." He set about building a fire. Clara watched him, mesmerized by the raw, coiled power in his movements. When he spoke, his words were sparse, but his gaze was heavy, filled with an intensity that made Clara's heart race. "You live out here alone," Julian said, more of a statement than a question, as he sat on the hearth, the orange glow of the flames highlighting the sharp angles of his face. "I like the quiet," Clara replied, wrapping a dry blanket around her shoulders. "But lately, the woods haven't been so quiet. I've seen strange things on my cameras." Julian's body went completely still. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across his face. "These woods are old, Clara. Some things are better left unstudied." He stood and walked over to the sofa, sitting beside her. The proximity was overwhelming, the air growing thick, charged with an undeniable primal tension. Clara looked at his lips, then back to his eyes. Julian leaned in, his breath warm against her cheek. When his lips met hers, all thoughts of caution vanished. The kiss was hungry, possessive, and wild, fueled by a desperation that seemed to surprise them both. Julian's hands gripped her waist, pulling her flush against his burning chest. It was a sensory overload, the smell of rain on his coat, the heat of his skin, and the raw, dominating force of his embrace. Clara yielded to him completely, lost in a storm of passion that raged far hotter than the tempest outside. That night, in the shadows of the cabin, they crossed a line from which there was no return. Chapter 2: The Blood Moon's Secret. Over the next month, Clara's life became divided into two halves: the mundane light of day and the electric, shadow-filled nights with Julian. He was an enigma. He had no phone, no car, and when she asked where he lived, he merely gestured toward the deep, uncharted ridges to the north. Yet he always knew when she was alone. He would appear at her doorstep just as the sun dipped below the tree line, his amber eyes burning with a desperate hunger that only Clara seemed able to soothe. But as the days ticked by, Clara noticed a change in him. The moon was waxing, growing larger and brighter in the night sky, and with its growth came a volatile restlessness in Julian. His skin, always warm, now felt feverish to the touch. His moods became unpredictable. He would pacing her cabin like a caged animal, his ears twitching at sounds Clara couldn't hear. Several times she caught him staring out the window into the dark woods, his jaw clenched so tightly she feared his teeth would crack. "Julian, talk to me," Clara pleaded one evening, stepping close and placing her hands on his chest. His heart was hammering at a frantic, terrifying speed. "You're burning up. Let me drive you to the clinic in town." Julian snatched her wrists. His grip was tight, bordering on painful, and for a fraction of a second, Clara saw his pupils contract, his amber irises expanding until they almost swallowed the white of his eyes. "No," he growled, his voice deep and vibrating with a strange layered resonance. He caught himself, shaking his head, and loosened his grip, kissing her wrists softly. "No clinics. I'm fine, Clara. It's just the season. The air is changing." "You're hiding something," she whispered. He looked at her, a profound sadness in his eyes. "I have to leave tonight. I'll be gone for a few days. The moon, it's going to be full. I need you to promise me, Clara. Lock your doors. Do not leave the cabin, no matter what you hear in the woods. Do you promise me?" "Promise me," he insisted, his voice cracking with a sudden, desperate emotion. "I promise," she whispered. He kissed her then, a hard, bruising kiss that felt like a farewell. Then he turned and vanished into the dark woods, moving so fast he was gone before the screen door had even finished swinging shut. 3 nights later, the valley was bathed in the eerie silver light of the full blood moon. Clara paced her cabin, unable to sleep. The silence of the forest was oppressive, heavy with anticipation. Then it began. It was a sound that started as a low, rumbling vibration in the earth, rising into a guttural, agonizing roar that echoed off the valley walls. It was a howl, but it carried a terrifying weight, a sound of bone cracking, flesh tearing, and a primal power that made Clara's blood run cold. It wasn't the howl of a normal wolf, it was the voice of a monster. Ignoring her promise, driven by an overwhelming instinct that Julian was in terrible danger, Clara grabbed her heavy coat, a high-powered flashlight, and stepped out into the freezing night. The air was crisp, and the moonlight was so bright she didn't even need the flashlight. She followed the sound, stepping over fallen logs and pushing through dense thickets. The scent of pine was replaced by something else, the metallic tang of fresh blood. She pushed through a final wall of brambles and stepped into a wide clearing known as the Devil's Half. The moonlight shone down on the snow-dusted ground, illuminating a scene that made her breath catch in her throat. A massive beast stood over the carcass of a freshly killed deer. It was a nightmare brought to life, easily 7 feet tall, covered in thick ash-gray fur, with long, powerful limbs ending in razor-sharp claws. Its back was hunched, its chest massive, and its muzzle dripped with dark crimson blood. Clara let out a soft gasp, stepping on a dry twig. The snap was like a gunshot in the silent woods. The beast spun around with supernatural speed, dropping to all fours. Its chest flared as it let out a deafening, chest-vibrating roar, its fangs bared, saliva stringing from its jaws. It lunged a step toward her, ready to tear the intruder to pieces. Clara froze, her flashlight dropping to the forest floor. She couldn't run. She could only stare. The beast stopped. The moonlight hit its face, and Clara looked directly into its eyes. Amber. They were the exact same liquid gold eyes that had looked down at her in the rain. They were filled with pain, confusion, and a sudden heartbreaking recognition. The beast's ears pinned back. The terrifying snarl died in its throat, replaced by a low, mournful whine, a sound so human it made Clara's heart ache. The creature took a step back, shaking its massive head as if in shame. Then, with a powerful leap, it vaulted over a massive boulder and vanished into the deep shadows of the forest. Clara fell to her knees in the cold mud, the pieces of the puzzle locking together. The trail cam photos, the unnatural heat, the fluid speed. Julian wasn't just a man, he was a werewolf. Chapter 3. The Vanishing and the Spawn. The morning after the full moon, Clara went to the abandoned timber cabin 3 miles north, a place Julian had once mentioned. The cabin was empty. The door swung open in the cold wind. Inside, the rustic furniture was untouched, but all of Julian's personal effects were gone. On the rough-hewn wooden table in the center of the room lay a single object, a heavy silver ring, engraved with the detailed image of a roaring wolf. He had fled. He had seen the horror in her eyes in the clearing, and he had chosen to run rather than force her to face what he was. Clara stood in the empty room, clutching the ring to her chest. She felt a profound sense of loss, a grief that hollowed out her stomach. But she didn't have time to mourn. Within 3 weeks, Clara realized her body was changing in ways that defied medical explanation. She was pregnant. The gestation was a terrifying, accelerated journey. By the end of the 2nd month, her belly had rounded significantly, looking closer to a 5-month pregnancy. When she went to a doctor in the city, the ultrasound machine showed a heartbeat that was incredibly fast, nearly 300 beats per minute. Fearing the medical community would treat her child as a specimen, Clara stopped going to her appointments. She returned to her cabin, locking herself away from the world. Her symptoms grew stranger by the day. She developed an intense, insatiable craving for raw meat, consuming rare steaks by the pound. Her senses became hyperacute. She could hear the beetles burrowing under the bark of the cabin walls and smell the exhaust of cars driving on the highway miles away. Her body temperature ran so high that she walked barefoot in the snow just to cool down. In her 3rd month, the labor began. It was a sudden, violent eruption of pain that brought Clara to her knees on the cabin floor. A storm outside raged, wind howling through the chimney as Clara gritted her teeth, clutching the bedposts. She had no midwife, no doctor. She had only her instinct and the memory of Julian's strength. The birth was an agonizing, primal ordeal. Her body tore, her blood hot as lava. But as the clock struck midnight under a crescent moon, a sharp, strong cry filled the room. Clara collapsed back, panting, and pulled the newborn to her chest. He was perfect, but he was not entirely human. Even as a newborn, his grip on her finger was strong enough to bruise. And when he opened his eyes, they weren't the dull blue of human infants. They were a bright, piercing amber. Raising Leo was a constant exercise in secrecy and fear. As a toddler, his physical development was astonishing. He was walking at 4 months, running at 6. When he threw tantrums, he had enough strength to crack the wooden legs of the kitchen chairs. But the real challenge came on the nights of the full moon. From the age of 3, the lunar cycle affected Leo just as it had his father. He would become feverish, his temper flaring, his small fingernails hardening and lengthening into sharp, black claws. During these nights, Clara had no choice but to lock themselves in the cabin's reinforced basement, holding her thrashing, screaming son in her arms. "Make it stop, Mama," Leo would sob, his small body shivering as patches of coarse, dark hair sprouted along his forearms, his teeth sharpening into tiny fangs. "The voice in my head, it wants me to run, it wants me to bite." "Shh, my sweet boy," Clara whispered, tears stinging her eyes as she rocked him against her chest, ignoring the scratches he left on her skin. "You are strong. You are human, Leo. You are my son. Hold on to me." She kept him isolated from the local school, homeschooling him and teaching him to hide his strength, to never look people directly in the eyes, and to keep his hands gloved during the winter months. But as Leo grew, the wolf inside him only became more restless. Chapter 4: The Wild Within. 10 years passed. Leo grew into a quiet, introspective boy with dark hair and his father's intense, watchful gaze. He possessed an innate grace, moving through the forest with a silence that seemed impossible for a child. His physical abilities were bordering on miraculous. He could outrun a deer in a dead sprint and detect the scent of a fox from 3 miles away. Clara did her best to anchor him to his human side, teaching him literature, science, and art, but they both knew the beast was waiting just beneath the surface, a coiled spring ready to snap. The turning point came on a crisp autumn afternoon. A group of local hunters from the town of Blackwood had tracked a wounded black bear onto the ridges bordering Clara's property. The bear, cornered and bleeding, let out a series of pained, desperate roars. 3 miles away, in the cabin, Leo's ears twitched. His eyes flared a bright, dangerous gold. "Leo, no!" Clara warned, sensing the sudden shift in him. But Leo was already out the door. He moved like a blur, leaping over the porch railing and disappearing into the dense brush. Clara grabbed her jacket and ran after him, but she was human. She couldn't keep up. By the time she reached the ravine, the hunters had already cornered the bear. But they weren't shooting. They were standing frozen, their rifles trembling in their hands. Leo stood between the hunters and the bleeding bear. His stance was low, his shoulders hunched, and a deep, guttural growl, a sound that shouldn't have been physically possible for a 10-year-old child, was vibrating in his throat. His fingernails had lengthened into claws, and his eyes were burning amber, reflecting the terror of the men before him. "What the hell is that thing?" one of the hunters whispered, his finger shaking on the trigger. "It's the biologist's kid," another gasped. "Look at his eyes. He's a monster." "Leo, stop!" Clara screamed, bursting through the trees. The sound of his mother's voice snapped Leo out of his trance. The gold in his eyes faded back to brown, and his claws retracted. He looked down at his hands, suddenly terrified of what he had done, and ran to Clara, burying his face in her side. The hunters backed away, their faces pale, before turning and fleeing back toward the town. The secret was out. Within days, rumors swept through the valley like wildfire. The local townspeople, already superstitious, spoke of a demon child living in the woods. But the rumors traveled far beyond the valley. They reached the Silver Order, a highly organized, fanatical group of mercenary hunters who used modern military gear and silver weaponry to purge the world of lichen filth. To them, a hybrid child was a mutation that had to be destroyed. The rumors also reached the local werewolf packs. For centuries, the wolves had lived by a strict code of secrecy, hiding their existence from humanity. A half-human hybrid child was a direct threat to that secrecy, an abomination that had to be put down to protect the pack. Clara began to notice the signs of encroachment. Strange, unmarked black SUVs idling on the dirt road near her driveway. The scent of foreign wolves, sharp, aggressive, and wild, lingering on the perimeter of her property. One morning, she found deep, jagged claw marks ripped into the wood of her front door, along with a warning: a dead crow, its neck snapped, left on the welcome mat. "We have to go, Leo," Clara said that night, packing a single duffel bag with food, money, and clothes. "We'll go north, past the border. We can't stay here." Leo looked out the window, his face pale in the twilight. "We can't outrun them, Mama. They've surrounded the valley. I can hear them, their heartbeats." Chapter 5. The Hunt Begins. The blizzard that descended upon Blackwood Valley on the night of the full blood moon was a monstrous entity. The wind did not merely blow. It shrieked like a choir of dying men, throwing frozen sheets of snow against the cabin's reinforced log walls until the timber groaned. Frost crept across the window panes in thick, jagged patterns, completely blocking out the silver light of the moon, leaving only a pale, ghostly luminescence filtering into the rooms. Deep beneath the house, in the cellar, Clara sat on a rusted iron cot, her knuckles white as she gripped a silver-plated hunting knife she had bought online under an alias. The air in the cellar was damp, smelling of old potatoes, cold stone, and the sharp, coppery tang of her own sweat. The cell reception had died hours ago, and the power grid had failed shortly after the wind began to scream. Now the basement was lit only by the flickering amber glow of 3 fat tallow candles. Beside her, Leo lay curled in a fetal position, his body convulsing in the grip of his first full transformation. The process was far more violent than the partial shifts of his childhood. He lay on a heavy woolen blanket, shivering violently, his skin so hot to the touch that when Clara tried to soothe him with a damp rag, the water instantly hissed and rose in thin wisps of steam. "Mama," he choked out, his voice already losing its human register, dropping into a deep, raspy scrape. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. She held his hand, watching in horror as the bones in his fingers cracked and elongated. Crack. Snap. The sound of his skeletal structure reshaping itself was sickeningly loud in the cramped basement. His shoulder blades pushed upward, tearing through his cotton t-shirt as the muscles of his back expanded and thickened. A dense, coarse layer of ash-gray fur began to erupt from his skin, starting at his wrists and crawling up his arms. "The voices," Leo growled, his head thrashing against the blanket. His jaw was lengthening, his teeth grinding together as his canines grew into curved ivory fangs. "They're so loud, Mama. They're in my head. They want to kill. They want to tear." "Fight it, Leo. Focus on my voice," Clara cried, leaning over him. She grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. His eyes were no longer brown. They were wide, burning pools of liquid gold. The pupils contracted into sharp, vertical slits. "You are my son. You are a boy, Leo. Do not let the wolf take your mind." Suddenly, a low mechanical hum vibrated through the stone floor. It was a sound Clara recognized all too well from her biology field days, the heavy diesel rumble of tactical vehicles. Clara crawled toward the tiny, high basement window. She brushed away the frost, looking out into the blinding snow. Through the whiteout, she saw 3 massive black SUVs cutting through her property line, their headlights painting the swirling snow in harsh blue-white beams. Men in heavy tactical gear, wearing Kevlar and night vision goggles, began to deploy from the vehicles. They moved with military precision, carrying assault rifles chambered with silver-tipped rounds. Across the chest of their body armor was a silver crest, a stylized wolf head caught in a pair of crosshairs. The Silver Order. Over their tactical radios, which Clara could hear faintly through the cellar window, a commander's voice barked commands. Target is in the basement. Move in. Standard silver gas load. If the mother resists, neutralize her. The hybrid dies tonight. But before the hunters could reach the porch, the darkness of the tree line exploded. With deafening roars, several massive grey-furred wolves leaped from the canopy of the forest, crashing directly into the tactical line. They were Silas's rogue pack, their eyes glowing red in the darkness. A brutal, chaotic skirmish erupted in the snow. A hunter was tackled to the ground, his throat ripped open before he could scream, his blood spraying hot and dark across the white snow. The other hunters opened fire, the rapid-fire pop-pop-pop of their rifles lighting up the blizzard. The smell of gunpowder and burning silver gas, a foul, sulphurous vapor that hissed out of canisters dropped by the hunters, seeped down through the cellar window. The silver gas hit the air in the basement. It was designed to weaken werewolves, and the moment it reached Leo, he let out a strangled, agonizing scream, his body twisting in a violent spasm. His skin began to blister where the vapor touched him. Clara scrambled to close the window, sealing it shut with a heavy wooden board she had prepared. She turned back to Leo, who was now standing on all fours, his body fully transformed into a terrifying, lean beast of ash and muscle. He was snarling, his ears pinned back, his primal instincts completely taking over as he smelled the blood and the silver gas. "Leo, please," Clara cried, holding the silver knife defensively, not to hurt him, but out of sheer, terrifying instinct. Upstairs, the sound of the front door splintering echoed through the cabin. The heavy, thudding footsteps of a large beast marched across the living room ceiling. The wooden floorboards groaned and bent under the weight. The creature was heading directly for the cellar door. Boom! The first strike against the reinforced basement door sent a shower of splinters and plaster dust raining down on Clara. The heavy iron bars she had bolted across the doorframe creaked. Boom! A second strike, louder than the first, bent the steel brackets. Boom! With a screech of tearing metal, the cellar door was ripped completely off its hinges. The heavy oak frame split in half. Thrown down the concrete stairs. Silas stood at the top of the stairs, his massive 7-foot half-wolf form silhouetted by the flickering emergency lights from upstairs. His grey fur was drenched in blood, both human and lupine, and his chest was heaving. He stepped down the stairs, his claws scraping against the concrete, his red eyes locked onto Leo. Behind Silas, 3 tactical hunters from the Silver Order pushed into the basement, their rifles raised, red laser sights cutting through the dim, candle-lit room, dancing across Leo's fur and Clara's chest. "A pathetic hiding place," Silas growled, his voice a guttural, layered rumble that shook the stone walls. "The abomination dies here, in the dirt, and the human whore who birthed him will watch." The hunters didn't wait. Realizing Silas was also a beast, the lead mercenary pulled his trigger, firing a silver-tipped round directly at Leo. "No!" Clara screamed, throwing her body between the rifle and her son, ready to take the bullet. Chapter 6. The Alpha's Return. Before the trigger pulls could release their deadly payload, a sound erupted from the stairwell that seemed to freeze time itself. It wasn't a howl. It was a deafening, earth-shaking roar of pure, unadulterated dominance, a sound that carried the weight of 1,000 pack leaders. The sheer acoustic force of the roar shattered the basement's glass window panes and sent a shockwave through the room, causing the hunters to drop their weapons, clutching their ears as their noses bled. From the shadows of the stairs, a monster of legend stepped forward. He was massive, easily 9 feet tall, with fur as black as a starless night, and eyes that burned with a brilliant golden fire. The air pressure in the room plummeted, making it hard to breathe. The raw power radiating from him was suffocating. Silas's red eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing terror. No, it can't be. The black wolf moved like a shadow. He crossed the basement in a fraction of a second. A single sweep of his massive clawed hand shattered the rifles of the hunters, throwing the men across the room. They hit the stone walls with bone-cracking force, collapsing unconscious. Silas tried to lunge, his instincts screaming at him to fight for his life, but the black wolf was too fast. He grabbed Silas by the throat, lifting the 7-foot beast off the ground with one hand. With a low, vibrating growl, the black wolf squeezed. The sound of Silas's windpipe crushing echoed through the quiet room. The black wolf threw Silas's limp body to the floor like a piece of trash. The giant beast turned, its golden eyes locking onto Clara and the partially transformed Leo. Clara held her breath, staring at the monster, but as the beast stepped closer, the terrifying golden fire in its eyes softened, returning to the warm, liquid ember she had fallen in love with 10 years ago. The transformation was quick, a fluid folding of bone and muscle. Within moments, the massive wolf was gone, and Julian stood before them. He was bare, his skin covered in the blood of their enemies, but his face was filled with a deep, aching tenderness. "Julian," Clara whispered, her strength finally failing as tears streamed down her face. Julian fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around both Clara and Leo. His skin was burning hot, his touch offering the same electric safety she had missed for a decade. He pulled Leo close, and the young boy, sensing the absolute authority and love of his father, calmed down, his claws retracting and the gold in his eyes fading. "I'm sorry I left," Julian murmured, his voice thick with emotion, pressing his forehead against Clara's. "I had to run. The Pax, they wanted to kill you to get to me. I had to go to the High Council. I had to take control." "Take control?" Clara asked, looking at Silas's body, then back to Julian. "I had to challenge the old Alpha," Julian said, his eyes flashing gold for a brief second. "I had to become the Alpha of Alphas to protect my family, to build a world where our son could live." Julian stood up, picking Leo up in his arms, and offered his hand to Clara. Together, they walked out of the ruined basement and stepped onto the snow-covered porch of the cabin. The yard was filled with dozens of wolves, their fur matted with snow and blood. Behind them, the remaining tactical trucks of the Silver Order sat abandoned, the surviving hunters having fled into the blizzard. As Julian stepped onto the porch, carrying the hybrid heir, every single wolf in the yard, wolves from Silas's pack, and wolves who had followed Julian from the north, dropped their heads, sinking their chests into the cold snow in a gesture of absolute, unquestioning submission. Julian looked down at the gathering, his voice carrying the power of the Alpha. "This is my mate, Clara," he declared, his voice echoing off the valley walls. "And this is my son, Leo. He is the heir to the Crescent Throne. Anyone who lifts a hand against them, human or wolf, answers to the Alpha." A low, harmonious howl began at the edge of the clearing, spreading through the pack until the entire valley was filled with a chorus of acceptance. Clara stood beside Julian, her hand locked in his, looking out over the pack. The long, terrifying night of hiding was over. Their family was whole, and their son's future was secured under the shadow of the Alpha.